Welcome to this scenic overlook, where a class of would-be potion masters are hard at work on assignments of questionable safety. With their help and the help of their surroundings, we will learn all about the mechanical and electrical events of the heart. Collectively, these events make up what is known as the cardiac cycle and cover everything from the start of one heartbeat to the beginning of the next. Given all that happens in what is typically less than a second of time, it can be helpful to start by breaking this cycle down into two basic parts. Diastole, the period of time during which the ventricles are relaxing, and systole, the period during which the ventricles are contracting. These can be further subdivided into 7 distinct phases, which we will walk through one at a time while looking at various changing parameters. This includes left ventricular pressure and volume, aortic pressure, left atrial pressure, the venous pulse, and the timing of the heart sounds. With all that out of the way, let's dive in. The first phase of the cardiac cycle is atrial systole. This phase is directly preceded by the P wave on the ECG, which represents the electrical activation or depolarization of the atria. It also happens to look a little bit like this rounded bush in the background. Note, going forward, each part of the ECG will be illustrated on this horizon line. This depolarization is translated into atrial contraction, which causes atrial pressure to rise and blood to be forced through the AV valves into the ventricles. This is sometimes referred to as the atrial kick, hence this kicking horse, and represents the final phase of ventricular filling, which corresponds with a slight increase in ventricular volume. Believe it or not, this horse is kicking because he used to be human. I wish I could say he's the first intern to suffer from being turned into a horse, or any animal for that matter. But actually, given my NDA, which I signed in triplicate and with ink that was derived from my own platelets, I've probably said too much. Moving on. In the right heart, the increase in right atrial pressure will also be transmitted back to the veins, where it will appear as the A wave on the venous pulse curve. This rounded mountain peak with an A-shaped gust of wind above it mimics this part of the curve to help you remember this. During this phase, the fourth heart sound, S4, may also be heard. It is thought to be caused by vibrations produced from the atrium contracting and pushing blood into a stiff or non-compliant ventricle. S4 is sometimes called an atrial gallop, which is why it is depicted here by the heart sound-like lines generated from this horse, kicking over a super stiff S4 chair. If S4 is heard, it is always considered abnormal and may be indicative of ventricular hypertrophy. The next phase is isovolumetric ventricular contraction, which begins during the QRS complex. See this QRS-like tree in the background. This represents the electrical activation or depolarization of the ventricles and translates directly to ventricular contraction and an increase in ventricular pressure, but with no change in volume. This mage is holding down the top of this bubbling cauldron to help you remember this. Like isovolumetric ventricular contraction, this will increase the pressure inside, but keep the volume of potion unchanged. This is possible because as the ventricles contract, the rising ventricular pressure will force the AV valves, the mitral and tricuspid, closed, which produces the first heart sound, S1. The heart sound-like lines coming from this corked bottle should help you remember this. Since the semilunar valves, the aortic and pulmonic, are also closed at this point, each ventricle will be closed off from the rest of the cardiovascular system, so no blood will be ejected and the ventricular volume will remain unchanged. The third phase of the cardiac cycle is rapid ventricular ejection, during which the left ventricular pressure will exceed the aortic pressure. As soon as this happens, the aortic valve will open and blood will be rapidly ejected into the aorta. not unlike how the pressure inside this cauldron has lifted its semilunar lid and ejected potion directly into this poor intern's soon-to-be long face. Due to the large pressure gradient between the ventricle and aorta, most of the stroke volume will be ejected during this phase, and the ventricular volume will decrease dramatically. Atrial filling will also begin, and atrial pressure will begin to rise, which is why this small cauldron like bottle is being filled just behind our intern. At the same time, rising pressure in the right ventricle will cause the tricuspid valve to bulge backward into the right atrium, which will generate the C wave on the venous pulse curve. This is represented here by this partially obscured C-shaped sun resting above a sharp mountain peak that mimics this part of the curve. The fourth phase of the cardiac cycle is reduced ventricular ejection and begins with the T wave on ECG, which looks a bit like this rounded rock in the background. This represents the start of ventricular repolarization and marks the end of both ventricular contraction and rapid ventricular ejection. While this will lead to a decrease in ventricular pressure, ventricular ejection will continue and ventricular volume will decrease, just at reduced rates, hence the weak stream coming from this mostly empty cauldron. This occurs because the runoff of blood into the arteries will cause aortic pressure to fall more quickly than the ventricular pressure. So, the aortic valve will remain open and blood will continue to be ejected. Atrial filling will continue during this phase, which is why our small bottle is being filled in between these two cauldrons. Right atrial pressure will also continue to increase, which will appear on the venous pulse curve as the start of the rising V wave. This lone bird is rising up to the flying V above this third peak to show this. The fifth phase of the cardiac cycle is isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. During this phase, ventricular repolarization completes and the ventricles begin to relax. This leads to a drop in the ventricular pressures below the aortic and pulmonic pressures and the closing of the semilunar valves. See this closed semilunar lid, which will also produce the second heart sound, S2. This closure leaves the ventricles closed off from the rest of the cardiovascular system. So as the ventricles relax, the pressure inside will decrease, but the volume of blood inside will stay the same, kind of like the pressure and volume inside this cooling cauldron. As the aortic valve closes, there will also be a small amount of backflow into the ventricles that is suddenly stopped when the valve snaps shut. This sudden stoppage results in a transient increase in the aortic pressure, followed by a slow decline that produces a distinctive dichrotic notch, or incisura, on the aortic pressure tracing. This inattentive student is eating a large tray of dichrotic nachos to remind you of this. Next up is rapid ventricular filling. During this phase, the ventricles relax. Ventricular pressure falls below the atrial pressure, and the AV valves, mitral and tricuspid, open, leading to the passive but rapid filling of the ventricles. This is represented by this careless intern in a bicuspid jester hat for the mitral valve, who is filling her cauldron way too quickly. Since the ventricles are relaxed and compliant at this time, the ventricular volume will increase with little to no increase in ventricular pressure. This rapid filling may also produce a third heart sound, S3, that is thought to be caused by the vibration of a very compliant ventricle or the tensing of the chordae tendineae. Sort of like how this rapid filling of this cauldron has produced these heart sound-like lines. S3 is typically normal in children, but is often abnormal in adults. During this phase, the flow of blood from the right atrium to the right ventricle will lead to the falling phase of the V wave on the venous pulse curve. This is depicted here by another solitary bird that is flying down and away from the flying V above the peak. Last but not least is reduced ventricular filling, or diastasis. During this phase, ventricular filling continues, but at a much slower rate, hence why this overly cautious intern is filling her cauldron so slowly. At rest, this phase is the longest of the cardiac cycle, although its length is determined by the heart rate. As the heart rate increases, there is less time in between beats for ventricular filling, which will greatly reduce or even eliminate this phase. This will, in turn, lead to a decrease in end diastolic volume and, due to the Frank Starling mechanism, a decrease in stroke volume. To help you remember this is this teacher. He is pointing at his elevated heart watch to let our cautious intern know that her time is running out and she will be unable to adequately fill her cauldron. The end of this phase is marked by the next P wave, hence another rounded bush in the background here, which brings us right back to where we started, at atrial systole. And that's the cardiac cycle. We're not doing the song and dance number? Okay. I know we covered a lot today, and it all happens in the blink of an eye and around 100,000 times a day. But before we ride off into the sunset on a newly transfigured horse, let's take one last look at what we've learned. The cardiac cycle details all the mechanical and electrical events of the heart for one heartbeat and can be broken up into 7 distinct phases. The first phase, atrial systole, is directly preceded by the P wave and represents the final phase of ventricular filling. The atria contract, atrial pressure rises, and a small amount of blood is forced into the ventricles. In the right atria, the increase in pressure is transmitted backwards to the veins, creating the A wave on the venous pulse curve. The fourth heart sound, S4, also called an atrial gallop, may be heard during this phase and is always considered abnormal. The second phase, isovolumetric ventricular contraction, begins during the QRS complex. The ventricles contract and the AV valves close, producing the first heart sound, S1. Due to this closure, the ventricular pressure increases, but the ventricular volume remains unchanged. The third phase, rapid ventricular ejection, begins when the left ventricular pressure exceeds the aortic pressure and the aortic valve opens. Blood is then rapidly ejected into the aorta, and ventricular volume drops dramatically. Atrial filling will also begin, and the atrial pressure will begin to rise. In the right heart, rising pressure in the right ventricle will cause the tricuspid valve to bulge backwards into the right atrium and produce the C wave on the venous pulse curve. The fourth phase, reduced ventricular ejection, begins with the T wave. This represents ventricular repolarization and marks the end of ventricular contraction. Ventricular pressure will start to drop during this phase, but ventricular ejection will continue at a reduced rate due to arterial runoff. Atrial filling and pressure will continue to increase, which will appear as the start of the rising V wave on the venous pulse curve. The fifth phase, isovolumetric ventricular relaxation, begins with the end of the T wave and the start of ventricular relaxation. As the ventricles relax and the ventricular pressure falls, the semilunar valves close and produce the second heart sound, S2. This closure produces the dicrotic notch and is why the ventricular pressure can decrease, but the volume inside remains unchanged. The sixth phase, rapid ventricular filling, begins when ventricular pressure falls below the atrial pressure and the AV valves open. This leads to the rapid, passive filling of the compliant ventricles and increased ventricular volume with little or no increase in ventricular pressure. This rapid filling may produce the third heart sound, S3, which is often normal in kids but abnormal in adults. As the right atria empties, there will be a decrease in right atrial pressure that will appear on the venous pulse curve as the falling phase of the V wave. The last phase of the cardiac cycle is reduced ventricular filling, during which ventricular filling continues, but, wait for it, at a reduced rate. This phase's length is determined by the heart rate, with any increase shortening it. With less time for filling, this will lead to decreases in end diastolic volume and, due to the Frank Starling mechanism, a decrease in stroke volume. And there you have it. Now that you know all the ins and outs of the heart,
To the cafeteria, where I shall filleth mine plate of nachos. Make haste! Shotgun on the intern, I mean horse.